is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 436. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how did the GP go, buddy?
It went all right. I went 11-4 in the Legacy Grand Prix, played lands as I promised to do, and I had a good time. I mean, I wish I had won 2 more matches, but I was happy with how I played and happy with my deck choice. Can't really do a whole lot more than that.
Deck seemed quite good. I remember we got you on camera on day 1, and you were playing against your old friend Elves, and you put a bit of a clinic on Elves, I have to say. That was kind of ugly at some points.
Oh yeah, that is actually one of the few good combo matchups lands has, because it's pretty good at punishing small creatures.
Yeah, I was in the booth with Reed Duke for that, and he was like, "Actually, this is a pretty good matchup for Luis." And then, boy, you made his words sing because you showed us why. It was fun having you back in the feature match area too. I hope you get to,
hopefully next time I'll stick around a little longer.
Indeed. All right, so this is of course the show where we look forward to Dominaria, the next set that's going to be coming out. It looks like a really exciting set, and I know people are really stoked for it. And we've got some exclusive limited resources preview cards to talk about, and we're going to go over the rules and mechanics for Dominaria. And the reason why we're doing that now, of course, is that the set review is coming up, and we can shortcut not having to do this whole process while trying to do the set review, because I'm sure as a listener, you know what a lift that can be and how much time it can take just to get through each and every card like we do. And so this way we can offset it. And this also gives us a little more space to go more in depth on these rules and mechanics and kind of flesh it out for ourselves and get our opinions out. And that's what we're going to be covering today. I want to remind you the show is brought to you, of course, by our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's the place to go on the internet for everything you need, including entertainment. If you want to be entertained, you can watch some of the videos or read some of the articles. Informative, entertaining, it's all the same, right? And while you're there, you can buy cards. I mean, they have everything. If you need sealed product, if you need singles, you're going to find it at channelfireball.com. We highly recommend them. You can also pre-order Dominaria right now. That's right. Right now. And the minute it's ready to ship, they're going to put it in the mail and they'll get it out to you as soon as they possibly can. You also can support the show directly via the Patreon. That's patreon.com/limited resources. Thank you so much to each and every one of you who support the show. We really appreciate you. And you can find out more information on lrcast.com or patreon.com/limited resources. One of the cool perks that you get is you get to submit questions for the Patreon question of the week. And we've got that here from our friend Alex, who says, "Hello, gentlemen. What are your thoughts on MTG puzzles as a way to improve limited skills?" He says, a friend of his and him run a weekly win this turn puzzle project. And one of our goals is to help players improve at finding outside of the box plays. These situations are typically way more outlandish than your average limited game, but having now made a bunch of these, I find myself sometimes spotting creative plays in limited that actually produce a big advantage or a win in a spot where maybe I wouldn't have spotted it otherwise. It's definitely more fun than strategy, but I feel that there's at least some amount of edge to be gained with these puzzles. Do you guys ever try them? What are your thoughts? And by the way, if you want to see them, Alex says that they're at possibilitystorm.com if you want to check out some of the puzzles. What were these called back in the day when they were in the magazines?
The puzzling.
Yeah, that's what it was. So what do you think, Luis? Do you think that these are just for fun, or do you think you can actually learn something from it?
So it's kind of funny. On the one hand, I think that they are largely just for fun because they don't really mimic any actual event, game states that are really going to happen. They're very convoluted. Mm-hmm. But I do actually think that it's useful to try to think of creative ways to use cards, and what sets apart, the great players from the good players is finding unconventional uses for their cards. So there's something in this space that's useful. I don't know if it's literally going through the puzzles that, you have set out here, but spending time thinking about weird corner cases for your cards, I think sometimes does bear fruit. I have spent a lot of my time just thinking about weird plays, and sometimes you get a chance to use them. Try not to be too clever, try not to look for these plays or force them, but know that when they do come along, sometimes you do target yourself with, surgical extractions, or sometimes you do make, pump your opponent's creatures. These are like the kind of plays that don't happen very often, but having them in your range is important, and puzzles can help with that.
Yeah, I know that you and I are fans of playing other games that, have little chunks of the skill set that you need in Magic to help you develop a bigger sense for how games work in general. I know that I gained a lot from having put a lot of time in on poker before coming over, for example, to Magic. And, those are the type of things that crossover works. And maybe this has like a small version of that, where these puzzles don't relate to Magic directly in the sense that they almost never come up, like Louis said. But it does exercise a part of your brain that you might not be working. And that's got to be something. Plus, they're kind of fun. I mean, I would never say don't do them, but, what's the strategic value? Well, it's probably not through the roof, but there's probably a little something there. And maybe they're cool. I don't know. Check them out. We're not going to do a Crack-A-Pack this week. And by the way, thanks for the question, Alex. I do appreciate it. We're not going to do a Crack-A-Pack this week because, well, we don't have a Dominaria pack, and doing a pack from the previous set doesn't feel right. So instead, right to business, we're going to jump into our rules and mechanics show. I'm going to start things off with the stuff that's going to be changing. I'm just going to kind of brush over this stuff because it's not super specific to limited, but there are some changes coming in Dominaria, a little bit of an overhaul on some stuff. And I figured it would be worth it to mention it here. Some of these things are more cosmetic. For example, there's now going to be a separator down in the rules box between a separator bar between any italicized reminder text and the flavor text of that card. Basically, they realized that it could get a little bit confusing if there was that reminder text, the one in the parentheses, and then flavor text. And some maybe newer players or less experienced players would get a little bit confused by that. So they decided to put just a little divider bar there. So if you see that, you'll know, okay, anything after this is flavor text. One other change that's kind of cool, it's just visual, but legendary cards are going to have an extra kind of this flourish at the top of the frame. If you've seen it, it looks kind of like a stylized, I don't know, crown or some type of, little extra graphics or whatever at the top of the frame, right above the tagline. That's, where the name of the card and the casting cost and stuff is. And that is actually going to continue after Dominaria as well. They're not changing the Planeswalker frames. They figure those are already pretty cool. Another small change to the wording is mana sources will now just say tap, add blue, rather than tap, add blue to your mana pool, since people don't really use the mana pool as like a thing. It's just, they know that it just makes mana and that's what it does. They figure they just simplify the text box and make onboarding of new players a little bit easier. Another one that's been talked about quite a bit is they're going to use a singular they. It's going to replace him or her or he or she, that kind of thing. A card that previously read as target player reveals his or her hand now reads target player reveals their hand. This just saves a lot of extra words on the card, because think about it. When you just talk, when we talk, we don't say he or she, like it just ends up being this long sentence. So people usually just say they. And so it just reflects the common language usage that we actually use a little bit better. And then on top of it, they mentioned it, they're kind of getting a free roll on using more inclusive language for people who don't identify as he or she. And I think that's cool too. It's like, it's kind of a 2-for-1 here. It's more inclusive and it's cleaner. So that's cool. And then the last one is this spell will replace self-referential text on cards for simplicity's sake. So instead of a card saying, as an additional cost to cast whatever the card's name is, it will read as an additional cost to cast this spell. And it just says, anytime it's referring to itself. So those are all relatively small changes, but I think they're all good. They all clean up the text box a little bit. But if you see those, just know that that's how it's going to be going forward. It's not just a Dominaria thing, and that those are kind of the way we're going to go. Now, there was one actual rule change for Dominaria, but I'm also going to brush over this because it comes up in limited so infrequently, but it is worth noting, which is they're getting rid of the rule that forces you to target a player with like a damage spell and then redirect it to a planeswalker, which is of course why it's not, how often do you get a planeswalker in limited? It doesn't come up that often, but you should be aware that spells like this will read that they can do damage to quote any target, kind of like the original printing from Lightning Bolt. And any target is shorthand for any creature, player, or planeswalker. You can't target lands or whatever, only relevant things. But you're going to be targeting the planeswalker directly now with cards like this rather than having to go through the player. And some older cards are also going to be errated to reflect this. And new cards are going to be printed this way going forward. But this will come up again rarely and limited. But if you or an opponent has a planeswalker, you do target it directly now. So that's a little bit different. Okay, so why don't we get into the actual new cards and new mechanics for Dominaria now that we got the kind of big picture stuff out of the way. And I think we should start with sagas, Luis, because these are the ones, at least to me, that kind of stand out both visually and,
These are the cards also that if you hadn't played with this set before, your opponent cast on there high on the list of like, wait, what?
What is that? Yeah. So these are enchantments. All of the sagas are enchantments, but they actually act kind of like planeswalkers in a weird way. You get an immediate effect when you cast it and if it resolves, and then you get another one, and then kind of this ending effect. Think of it sort of like the saga's ultimate. But they're not as flexible, of course, as planeswalkers because they just happen. You don't get to choose which effect happens when. They just happen. And they're also a bit more resilient because they are, of course, enchantments and can't be attacked by creatures, but a little more technical so that you know how they actually work. So you use lore counters, which is just a name for the counter, to track which of the 3 chapters you are on. And each of these sagas has 3 chapters that are marked pretty clearly on the left-hand side of the card. The saga enters the battlefield with 1 lore counter on it automatically. And once that happens, it will put a triggered ability on the stack for whatever chapter 1 does. And then, of course, players can respond to that as they see fit. It won't happen until that ability resolves. Then, and this part's a little weird, as your first main phase starts or just after your draw step, you'll add a lore counter to the saga. Now, this is not a May ability, so you don't get to like space this out. It just happens automatically. And the lore counter going on the card does not use the stack. It just happens. So there's a lore counter just appears on it. And then, and also you can't cast sorceries or creatures or anything like that before the lore counter goes on because it happens at basically the beginning of your first main phase. So that happens. Now, once the second lore counter's on it, then chapter 2 will trigger. And that happens like the other one. It will go on the stack. And if that ability resolves, you'll do whatever it says. And occasionally chapters 1 and 2 will be the same effect, or, they can group them like that. Then that'll happen again on the next turn with the third lore counter. The saga's 3rd chapter will trigger. And once that trigger resolves, or more accurately, once it's not on the stack anymore, even if it gets countered or exiled or whatever, once it leaves the stack, the saga is over and the enchantment itself is then sacrificed. So we've got one as kind of an example to walk you through. So this one's called Triumph of Gerard. It's an uncommon saga. Again, they're all enchantments. It's an enchantment with a subtype saga. It's 1 and a white, and its first and second chapters are the same in this case. So chapters 1 and 2 are put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with the greatest power. So you pay 1 and a white. This thing enters the battlefield. A triggered ability goes on the stack. It has a lore counter on it already. And then you're going to target your creature with the greatest power. If that ability resolves, it's going to get a counter on it. Chapter 2 is the same. So the next turn, that same thing happens. Chapter 3 says target creature you control with the greatest power gains flying, first strike, and lifelink until end of turn. So your biggest creature becomes this absurdly overpowered creature for the turn. You get your hit in. And then at that point, the Triumph of Gerard is gone. So these are a little bit complex, Luis. They weren't messing around with these. Also, they look weird because they're like the artwork's vertical.
Yeah, so looks like a cycle of them. Each color has a common an uncommon or rare in a mythic.
Okay.
And they are very complicated. They really do 2 or 3 different things, right? Because they either have 3 abilities or 2 abilities. Because sometimes they like this one, they double up the first one.
Mm-hmm.
What they have in terms of impact, I don't think it ends up being that big for the limited format. Like, you will play with and against these, and they will be good. But for the most part, they just kind of do what they say. I don't think you need to go super deep to make these cards good. And
agreed.
Once you get used to playing them, I think they look like they're going to be very cool. But I don't think that this is like you have to learn a completely new thing. This isn't exactly Planeswalkers because they just happen. You can't really, unless you have an enchantment removal, you can't really stop them. And even then, they'd get the first trigger off.
Exactly. To me, just the ones that I've looked at kind of briefly, looking, when we were making the show notes for this episode, they look strong to me. Like this, like even Triumph of Gerard, which is an uncommon one. There's rare and mythic ones too. This card looks like it has a lasting effect on the game. And even though the chapter 3 is more of a short-term gain, it's quite a big one.
I think that this is going to end up being a pretty big swing. And
yeah.
They are easy to anticipate. They're going to give their biggest creature all those abilities, so you just save your removal spell for that turn, but it doesn't mean that these aren't powerful.
Agreed. So, yeah, and they are interesting. Just remember, the rules about when stuff goes on and how you get to use it. And think of it like these are meant to represent some of the more important stories from like the storyline of the set or whatever. And you're kind of getting to view them and experience them as it goes along.
Cool
so
to tell a story.
Yeah. What do you think about just like this isn't related to anything specific, but what do you think about the look of it?
I think they look really cool. And
vertical artwork's really neat.
Yeah, they look very historic. I think it's going to end up working out pretty well.
Yeah. The one thing I don't like is that they had to jam the reminder text in the upper left-hand corner, and it's kind of awkward. Like it says, as this saga enters and after your draw step, add a lore counter, sacrifice after 3. It's a little, I'm not saying I could have done better or that, they could have necessarily, but I had to read the rules to actually really understand exactly what was going on there.
It is tricky, but I don't think you can get around that really.
No, but the artwork looks really cool. Okay. So that's one of the things. Let's get into historic.
So historic is kind of like the tagline for legendary, and what the card types that are historic in quotes are artifacts, any artifact, legendary permanents. So in this set, I think it's going to be mostly creatures, but legendary permanents and sagas are what we just talked about. So these show up at a much higher rate than they would in a normal set. You're seeing like legendary at uncommon, for example, and you normally wouldn't see uncommon legendary creatures. And you have a bunch of cards in the set that care about historic permanents or historic cards. So like, there's a card that gets +1/+1 when you play a historic card. Or like Urza's Tome, where you get to draw a card, and then unless you exile a historic card from your graveyard, you have to discard a card. So you end up caring about the actual just type of these. So it's kind of like a tribal, except the tribe is artifacts, legendary cards, and sagas.
Right. Yeah. So kind of a weird one. There's also, like you said, under legendary counts planeswalkers, legendary creatures, and now kind of a new thing, legendary sorceries, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that's a new thing as well. But as you might imagine, some cards might care about you, say, casting one of these, while other ones, like the one that you mentioned, cares about it being in the graveyard. So there's some different interactions there. The thing that stands out to me, Luis, is artifact, right? Like legendary creatures, well, we generally don't see a lot of those. There's more of them in this set than normal, but still, they're not, on the battlefield all the time. Sagas, I don't think there's any common ones, or I don't know actually for sure, but, I assume that those are going to be sought after and of higher rarity. But artifact just doesn't even matter what it is. Artifact seems to be the easiest way to get historic going.
So I don't think we're going to be quite in the like affinity play every artifact that costs 1 realm, but you could easily end up with a deck with 2 or 3 cards that care about artifacts, care about historic cards. And as such, random artifacts, like maybe like mediocre artifacts, could end up making the cut, especially at a higher rate than you might assume they would.
Right. Some of the cards, by the way, do care about historic cards being cast, and you need to pay attention to those because you do actually have to put those on the stack. Like if you have a historic card enter the battlefield, it will not trigger. And if the card specifically says when you cast a historic spell, remember that isn't the same thing as getting one into play. It actually has to go on the stack. What colors did you kind of had an idea for an early take on what colors Historic was all about?
There's
right?
a little bit more support in the Esper colors. I think there's actually still one green card. It gets a ++1 encounter. It's like a Savage Stomp, but for Historic. But for the most part, Esper, black, white, and blue has a few more reasons to care about this. It's a pretty light touch, and we're going to keep saying that. There are a lot of themes in the set, but they're not very deep, which I think is going to lead to kind of interesting and complicated drafting and deck building, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, I think that sounds really cool. Now, you also mentioned when you're playing against somebody playing Historic, there's maybe some other considerations you want to take into play.
Yeah, you could very easily be playing against someone who cares about this card type, and especially, again, if they're like Esper colors, maybe you prioritize killing their legendary cards a little bit higher.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at least as a tiebreaker, right? Just so you know. And of course, we'll figure that out. But that's interesting. I think that this seems to be one of the major sub themes of the set, right? I mean, this is like, to me, the sagas and the Historic are the things that really stand out as like the kind of we went for it type thing in this set.
This is one of the louder parts of the set. I do still think it's not super impactful, like when it comes to limited. Like, I'm not saying it doesn't have any impact, but this is not the same as like this set is tribal, even though it has some of the same aspects. So I think this takes up a lot more brain space because of how loud it is than it actually will like when you're drafting.
Okay, so your take on it then is that this is more of the incidental value type situation rather than like a full-on build around?
I think so. I just don't think you're going to end up with like a deck with 10 cards that care about Historic and 12 Historic cards. I think that's just pretty unlikely. What I think is going to happen is you're going to have like 2 to 3 cards that care about this and like 5 to 6, maybe 7 ways to trigger it. And that's like a good little package, but it's not 14 Merfolk or anything along those lines.
Yeah, totally. Okay. And of course, we'll be sliding that scale based on what our payoffs are, right? I mean, if we get some mythic rare that cares about Historic, but the mythic rare is so good that, you actually want to build around it, well, maybe we'll lean more in that direction. I mentioned a minute ago a new type of card called a Legendary Sorcery, which is something that's, again, new here. They really did kind of go all out on this.
All the stuff, so yeah.
Yeah. Legendary Sorceries are interesting. They represent iconic moments from Magic's history. But, for us spikes where that kind of thing isn't really what we're in it for, it probably just means they're going to be really powerful, right? I mean, it's a safe bet to think that if they're going to make these specific type of legendary sorceries, these major events, that they're not going to have it like, do 1 damage to each player or something. These things are going to be really sweeping effects, I would guess. Now, here's the interesting part, though, and this also makes me think that they're even more powerful. So as a result of that, they're made even more difficult to cast than a normal sorcery. So these aren't just sorceries that happen to be legendary. You actually have a restriction on when you can cast them. And the restriction is you must control a legendary creature or planeswalker in order to even cast a legendary sorcery. Legendary artifacts and other permanents do not count. They're not good enough. And this is a casting restriction. So even if the legendary creature or planeswalker like gets killed with the legendary sorcery on the stack, you still get to resolve it. It's just a restriction that says you can't cast it until you control a planeswalker or a legendary creature. Yikes.
That's a pretty big cost.
That is extremely brutal, right?
I'm like, wow. To cast these like some percentage of the time, but judging from the payoffs, it will be worth putting these in your deck. You just know you're not always going to be able to cast it.
Yeah. So another thing leaning us in a direction, but not necessarily seeming like it's all in. So we'll have to see that when we do the set review to think, well, how far can I actually go with this Historic thing? Because these legendary sorceries can trigger it too, and they can work within that. And if you're doing the Historic thing, well, you're probably more likely to, like you said, Luis, like do tiebreaker picks towards legendary creatures and that kind of stuff, and maybe you can just end up with a huge bomb as a legendary sorcery. Alternatively, they might just be extremely difficult to cast and not worth the risk. So that's what we're going to have to suss out when we get into it. All right. So the next mechanic is actually a returning mechanic, and it's a pretty elegant one. It's called Kicker. Kicker
is a really old mechanic. It showed up in Invasion Block the first time. And at its core, it's really simple. So what Kicker is spells with Kicker have an additional kicker cost, and that's a mana cost, or it could actually even be a non-mana cost like sacrifice a land. But I think for the most part, we're just seeing mana costs. If you choose to pay that mana cost as you cast the spell, you'll get the kicker bonus. So we can give you an example. You've got Academy Drake. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flying Drake at common, and it has kicker 4 colorless. I guess actually 4 generic mana. Now that colorless means something. Whatever. Kicker 4.
Yep.
And it says if Academy Drake was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So it's either a 3 mana 2/2 flyer or a 7 mana 4/4 flyer. And,
nice.
And we will see a bunch of cards like this where you have an additional cost, and basically you get to play the card for its base, like the 3 mana 2/2 flyer mode. Or if you want, you can pay a little bit extra and get a bigger effect or a better effect. In some cases, the effects are very different. And kicker is a really fun mechanic because modal cards like this are really cool. They give you cards that are relevant on, turn 6 and relevant on turn 12, or relevant on turn 3 in this case, and then relevant on turn 7+. And that's a really powerful ability. There's a reason kicker just keeps coming back over and over and over again, partially because the design space is really wide, and partially because it plays really well.
Yeah. One of the things we should mention as well about the rules is you do pay it all at once. You mentioned that. So you don't get to put a card on the stack and then say, well, is it resolving? Okay, I'll pay the rest of the kicker. You pay all at once as if it were one casting cost. And also you can only pay that kicker cost once. They did actually make a mechanic called multi-kicker that would let you do it multiple times. But I've definitely seen people pre-release, figure, well, I'll just add another 4 mana and get 2 more +1/+1 counters. But you with regular kicker like we have here, you can just do it once. These are the type of cards that to me, I really am drawn to for limited. Because they let me be flexible with my mana and they let me strategically plan things out and make basically different decisions. I mean, if you have, the first half of that card you mentioned is a Windrake, right? 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flying. I mean, there's not a lot of strategic decision behind a Windrake. You cast it when you can cast it and then it does what it does. That's fine. But man, just throwing something like a kicker cost on it, even if it's kind of expensive, right? I mean, the example you gave is 7 mana, right? I mean, you are talking about a pretty big investment. I love the idea that I can actually play my strategy and my game plan around, no, I need to get that thing on the battlefield now. It's going to do way more damage on average than if I wait. Or, hey, I drew that thing on turn 6. With 6 mana, I've got 1 more land to go, and then I'm going to get a big 4/4 flyer rather than this little 2/2, and that's going to make a big difference. So I'm going to strategically decide not to cast my spell. That's great, right? I mean, all the mechanics I really like along these lines kind of originated with this idea of kicker, which is, the ability to pay more for more. And you did mention it, but kicker doesn't have to be mana. That is very true. There's creatures getting sacked and all different types of stuff. Discard cards, whatever. Yeah,
and the flexibility is really, there. Let's look at Vicious Offering. It's a 1 and a black instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. It is a kicker of sacrifice a creature, and if you do, the creature you target gets -5/-5 until end of turn instead. So,
that is really cool.
Yeah, this card's really cool. You'll always play 1 in a black, give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn. And then this also means in the late game when you have a creature lying around you don't need, you can sack a creature to then kill their 4/4 flyer. So
that's really cool. Yeah. And they're fun for us to evaluate as well, because of course it all comes down to the cost, right? Well, what am I getting? I mean, I'm going to take a kicker cost on a normal card like a Windrake, and I don't really care what the cost is because it's just upside, but how good that card is absolutely matters on, if the kicker cost on that Windrake you mentioned was 3, that's a totally different card, right? That's just that's a complete game changer. And I love that. I think that's really, really cool. And one of the things that you actually said, Luis, that I think is a really interesting take on it is that you almost view it like these are really good late game cards that you also can play early when you need to, which I think most people look at these cards and say, oh, it's a Windrake that I could play, but then sometimes I'll get this extra bonus. But you're actually kind of focusing on the fact that that these can be so powerful in the late game, and that's almost their primary role for you.
Well, if you have Academy Drake and then you have a 4 mana 3/2 flyer, the 4 mana 3/2 flyer doesn't get any better over the course of the game. It's a fine card, you'll play it, but the Academy Drake does. So you really do have incentive to save kicker cards if you can afford to. So I'm not saying I wouldn't play nothing on turn 3 instead of playing a Drake, I'll just play the Drake. But if I have a different turn 3 play and then I have a turn 4 play, I'll just play those two, and then maybe I can see if I can slow roll the Drake until 7, because a big part of what's going to help you win more in this format is cast your spells with the kicker. If you cast spells kicked and your opponent tends not to, you're going to get more powerful effects over the course of the game. So trying to figure out a way to make that happen is really good. It also lets you play more lands, because when you have 6, 7, 8 drops, then you can play more lands, but you still don't have to give up an early game. So it really helps you actually get to play cards while also giving you an incentive to have a few more resources in your deck.
Which is like, you would prefer to have that, right? Because you have fewer games where you get mana screwed, and yet you still get to play Magic.
The strength of lands that have an additional ability, like the cycling deserts we saw in Our Devastation, is you could play 19 lands, infrequently get mana screwed, but also you don't get flooded. The downside of just putting 19 lands in your Rivals deck is that you just get flooded. But cards like Kicker does mitigate that pretty well.
And then you also had mentioned a little bit about some other types of cards perhaps getting a little bit better if there's a ton of kicker around.
Yeah, because your opponent is going to be casting more 7+ mana cards, discard and counter spells both get a lot better. Discard because it has relevant things to nab even later in the game. And then counters because, well, your opponent's tapping 7 mana for their cards. Counter spells get much better in that world.
Absolutely. So Kicker's back, and it's great. I'm really interested in Historic as a mechanic, but I have to say that once I saw that it's when I see cycling, when I see morphs, when I see Kicker, I'm just happy. I just find that the limited environments that utilize these as sort of one of the base mechanics I'm always happier. It's just, it makes for a more smoothed out, varied strategic decisions and stuff like that. And I really appreciate it. So I know Kicker isn't, the shiny new object or whatever, but boy, I feel like almost
these things excite me a lot more than weird new mechanics, because I know Kicker's going to play great. And then we have plenty of sagas for and Historic for the weird nonsense. You give me Kicker, I know I'll be satisfied.
Same. Next one is a small mention here, but it is a new twist on an old mechanic. So you and me, it is one of our least favorite mechanics. It is Hex Proof. They're actually twisting the Hex Proof and tweaking it a little bit, which is kind of cool. They're introducing a more narrow version of Hex Proof that's available. So you'll see cards that have Hex Proof from certain colors or types of cards. Like the example that Wizards gave on the site was a card that has Hexproof from black.
Yeah, and that is a cool way to kind of revamp protection, which has lots of problems. It doesn't surprise me that we're not seeing protection creatures anymore. Hexproof from black does a lot of what you want protection to do while still not locking out black creatures.
Yeah, I think that's really, really cool. And I'm really glad, honestly, that they're putting a little bit of effort into that, because both protection and hexproof are mechanics that discourage interaction. And, all of the best stories in Magic, all of the best games in Magic are centered around interaction. And, to me, that should be emphasized as much as possible. And mechanics like protection from a color or hexproof severely diminish interaction. I know that there's a certain percentage of the population that enjoys that kind of thing, but I just think everybody likes it when you get to play games where things are happening between each other. And once you get to the point where it's like, I just can't do anything, then the game kind of isn't that exciting anymore. So I like this a lot. And I'm hoping that they take Hexproof in that direction and kind of away from the general, this thing just has Hexproof direction.
For sure.
Tribal. There is a little bit of tribal going on here, it seems. And the first one we have is Wizard.
Yeah, there's a couple cards that key off Wizards, that mostly aggressive cards in red and blue. So there's a counterspell that's 1 cheaper if you have a Wizard, a lightning bolt that's 2 cheaper if you have a Wizard. Various wizards that when you play them, if you control wizards, do damage, that sort of thing. And as a result, there is this light tribal theme, and you might be thinking didn't we just get out of a tribal set? Is this the same thing again? And I actually don't think it's going to end up playing like that. I think your aggressive red-blue decks are going to have a couple wizards, and you might care about having a wizard in play, but you're not going to end up in a spot where you're playing 15 wizards in your deck. And
Okay.
I think it adds a little bit.
This
of
is what we
texture.
like, right?
What's that?
This is what we like, right?
I like what I really like in draft at the core of it is cards that change your pick orders. And that can be a build around where all of a sudden it's like, all my flying creatures get +2/+2. Well, I'm going to take all my flying creatures, or all your cards that cost 1 are unblockable, or every time you play an artifact, do X. Like cards that change your pick orders, I think, are really what makes drafting interesting, because otherwise you could just have a list and go down the list. And a light wizard tribal that changes how good you think wizards are is pretty nice. So I'm looking forward to drafting with this. When you're playing against it, maybe you try to remove their wizards from play, because a lot of their cards key off just having a wizard. And know that your opponent's going to be a little bit more aggressive. This is not wizard control. This is wizard beatdown. So try to play with that.
Yeah, that's cool. It's a good place to be. I definitely love incidental tribal interactions rather than forced. Is this real? Are Thalids actually back?
Yes. So Thalids are, again, a throwback to Fallen Empires, though they showed up in Time Spiral as well. Thalids are creatures that tend to create saplings, which are 1/1 tokens. So you have, a variety of green Thalids or token-making cards. Like there's just a straight-up sorcery, for example, that makes 2 1/1 saplings, and if you kick it, it makes 4.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's black cards, which are, different effects where you can sacrifice creatures to get a bonus. And in some cases, if you sacrifice a sapling, you get an even bigger bonus. So it's, again, a mini tribe, though this is more mechanically linked than it is tribal. Like the black sacrifice cards care about having creatures, and the green ones care about making creatures, but they don't really care too much that whether you're sacrificing saplings or night tokens. So you could see like a black-white deck playing the black Thalid sacrifice creatures and like white for night token making. It's an interesting pair, and I think black-green is going to definitely be real, but I think that this tribal thing is open-ended enough that like you could combine red or white with green and try to like play a go-wide aggro deck with the token making, or you can combine black with one of these colors and sacrifice other colored tokens to the black card. So it's very mix and match, which I think is sweet. And it is a minor sub-theme that you should keep an eye on.
Okay. Yeah. And it's also just kind of fun, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like if you played back in the day, I mean, Thalid's not a real word, right? Like they just made that up.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. I don't think I've heard that, but anybody who has, knows what those gross little things are. And I don't know, you kind of want to play with them. What about goblins?
So goblins are also back again in an unsurprisingly a tribal capacity. But what it looks like happened is they kind of stuck like half an onslaught block goblins deck into the file. Because
the old cards from like that legacy goblins deck from back in the day.
It makes me feel very old to hear those be legacy. That was in Type 2 and standard when I first started playing.
Oops, sorry.
But Siege Gang Commander and Goblin War Chief are the big ones, but those are rare and uncommon respectively. There's like Skirk Prospector at common, and what I'm not really seeing a big hook. I'm not really seeing a huge reason to be in goblins. Like if you open one of these rare uncommon goblin incentive cards, sure, but otherwise, I think it's again a footnote. It's the sort of thing where maybe you end up with 3 goblins and 1 card that cares about goblins, but you're not really going super deep on this.
I mean, Siege Gang Commander is quite a card.
Yeah, but it's also quite a card in a red deck that has mountains. Like,
yeah, that's what I meant. I don't need other goblins. Yeah. Okay. What about big picture perspective on this stuff? Because that's pretty much all of the specifics that we have, some tribes, and then the bigger picture on the rules, which hopefully you have a better understanding now about exactly how they work. So when you show up to the pre-release, you don't go, when does the lore counter go on? Can I respond to the lore? All of these weird things. What's your big picture take? Now, and of course I'll, put a caveat here. We're going to figure this stuff out after we do the set review and when we go through, but I don't know. We looked at a bunch of the cards. We have a little snapshot. What's your initial take?
It feels like there's a lot of small themes kind of coexisting here, and there's going to be some overlaps. Like you could have like an aggressive blue-red deck that has some goblin tribal, some wizard tribal. You could have a historic deck that has some artifacts, but also chooses to run one of these other themes as well. You could end up with 3 or 4 themes or no themes in your deck. Basically, Dominaria seems very light on like linear themes, which is like the opposite of Ixalan, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of themes which some do connect well. Like if you're playing a deck with a good sacrifice outlets, both goblins and thals look like they'll work well in your deck. But
Right.
there's some themes which don't seem to overlap really at all, and that's fine too. So I think the combination of the two means drafting is going to be hard in this set. I think you're going to end up having to value a lot of different cards differently based on what you already have in ways that not every set tests. And once you get good at knowing what the like starter packs are, like the historic deck starter pack involves like 2 historic cards that you care that cares about it and 4 other historic cards, and that's good.
Right.
Then that'll be a lot of mastery, and that'll really help you. If it takes 7 historic cards to work instead, that's a very different number. So you kind of have to know where that ends up.
Yeah, I had somebody on Twitter tell me that they wanted my initial take on Dominaria, but I haven't really absorbed enough of it to have that quite yet. But they did say something that stuck out to me that I agree with, which is that they thought it looked a little bit corset-y, is what they said. And I kind of agree, right? And I use that as a compliment, by the way. I'm a big fan of the corsets, and this one seems like I don't know how to put it, an advanced corset. Like they put in some pretty crazy mechanics that they would never.
Sets of all time are they're like corset feeling sets that really dial down on flavor, and this looks like it could be another one. I think the Dominaria has high potential.
Yeah, I do too, and it makes me excited about it because I'm seeing a lot of the things that I really like already. The kicker being there, and then as I mentioned, the sort of 1-2 punch style cards rather than the full linear archetypes. I think that's really exciting for sort of your baseline limited player. Okay, we've got our preview cards to go over, and then we're going to call it a show. So let's get into those. We actually have 5 of them, and they're all sort of centered around blue and white, and they're going to give us, I think, a pretty good idea of at least some of what blue and white might be up to. I'm going to start things off with a pretty simple card. It's called Even Sentry, and this is 3 and a white for a 3/2 with flying, and it's a bird soldier. This is we call these snapping drakes after the blue version.
Yeah, so this is a fine card. When I mentioned the 3/2 flyer for 4, I didn't even know if there was one in the set, but I guess there is.
There is indeed, and it's one of our preview cards. Hey!
They are the bread and butter of a set, and I would imagine you would always play this card.
Yeah, me too. And this, though, does kind of stand out again as a card that's kind of standalone, right? Like, I don't think there's a bird sub-theme or a soldier sub-theme.
About what's going on to think this card is fine. Like, there's some formats where this card would be bad. Like, in Triple M on Ket, it probably wouldn't be very good. And there's some formats where it would be great. But my initial take is that this is going to be fine in Dominaria.
Yeah, me too. Now, its friend, also a common, by the way, even Sentry's at common, is a card called Pegasus Courser, which is 2 and a white for a 1/3 with flying. So significantly worse stats, but it says whenever it attacks, another target attacking creature gains flying until end of turn. So it kind of picks up a ground creature.
It's been a powerful text box. We last saw it on 2 and a blue 2/1 flyer.
Yeah, Aerial Guide.
Yeah, which is much better than this card, though this card is good too. I would imagine this would be a very good addition to an aggressive deck.
Yeah, and right when I see these two cards next to each other, I start thinking, well, what is white up to? That's too evasive and wanting to attack, right? Like Even Sentry is a much better attacker than it is a blocker, and Pegasus Courser is also when you're really doing it is when you're attacking with it. So it makes me think that there's a possibility for this. And then when I look at the next common that we have, it's called Cloud Reader Sphinx. It's 4 and a blue for a 3/4 with, that's right, flying. And it has an extra ability when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2.
This being a common is kind of mind-blowing. This is a pretty beefy common.
Definitely. And scry 2 is no joke.
No, I think this card's going to be really good. It looks good in a blue-white flyers deck or a blue control deck or any blue deck. It just is it's a lot of value for 5 mana. I remember the days of 5 mana 3/3 flyer being like the benchmark good common. And while 5 mana 3/3 flyer is not exciting these days, 5 mana 3/4 flyer with scry 2 is quite a bit better. And I would imagine this does, by far clear the bar.
Yeah, I mean, Scry 2 is approaching the draw a card level, especially given that this thing costs 5 mana.
So you can just
you've likely, developed your mana base already. So, and now again, when I look at all three of these, we have 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop curve, all flyers, and one of them even gets another creature going. We very well may have ourselves a blue-white flyers deck in sort of the traditional archetype that we've seen. And again, out of the
Blue White Flyers has been the best draft deck in a lot of formats, though we haven't gotten to the best card that we got.
Yeah. So why don't you read the best card? Because this card it's absurd.
Yeah. It's 2 and a blue. It's a sorcery. And it says,
no, not that one. You're supposed to read the other
preview cards. It's divination. It's 2 and a blue. It's a sorcery. It's common, and you draw 2 cards.
That is, he's not actually joking. That is one of our preview cards. I was thinking you were going to read the other one.
Okay, fine. I'll read the actual best card. It's called On Sarah's Wings. It's 3 and a white. It's a legendary enchantment aura at uncommon. Enchanted creature is legendary, gets +1/+1, has flying, vigilance, and lifelink. But see, if you cast divination, you could draw On Sarah's Wings and a creature. You could draw both of those cards.
That is true.
Yeah, this card's an obscene bomb. Putting this on a creature and getting a hidden for 5 lifelink is just absurd. And even if they deal with it, you probably ended up okay. And if they don't deal with it, they just flat out lose. Like they're just dead.
They just lose the game. It has vigilance. Yeah, it's just stupid. And it's funny because we've adjusted our take on auras. You're just slamming A-. It's splashable too. It's 3 and a white. It's interesting because we've had to adjust our take on auras over the years. And the other thing that's happened is not only have the auras gotten better by virtue of the fact that the removal's slower, but on top of it, the auras themselves have just gotten better. I mean, this is a joke. That list of abilities, I don't know how important the legendary part of the creature being legendary is, but it has to be an upside.
It's upside, and then you also just have grafted 3 additional very good abilities.
Right. Evasion, the ability to keep blocking, and then the ability to swing a race.
Is legendary itself, so if somehow you drafted 2 of them, you, I guess, couldn't have both in play at once.
Wow, you're right. Awkward. Though you'd probably just run both of them anyway and just win the game, right?
Yes, of course you run both of them. They'd be great. You could also put it on your opponent's creature, and it would make it legendary, though I guess that doesn't matter.
That's true. No, that might matter. Maybe there's a card that cares about legendary things in a bad way. Like
That's true.
Kill a legendary something, or I haven't seen that, but
though
if that's the case,
if they have 2 Cloud Reader Sphinxes out and you put this on one of them, it doesn't do anything. Like they don't have to sack.
I don't think so either. I think they both have the legendary, right? Yeah, I was thinking about that too, and I'm not. I think that is
quirk of the rules of this set is that grafting legendary text, because there's also a control magic variant that grafts legendary text onto something.
Oh, interesting.
So you don't have to worry about that until multiple of your permanents become legendary.
Okay. Yeah. And I am curious. To me, when I read the card, when we got it for a preview card, I mean, my jaw dropped because I was like, holy smokes, that's a lot of power. But the thing is, the enchanted creature is legendary part was the part that stood out to me as just kind of weird. I can't conceptualize yet what that part does. I know what On Sarah's Wings being legendary itself means, and I know the others.
Yeah, it can't be killed by like things that say kill a non-legendary creature, for example.
Sure. I'm assuming it's upside, right? Like it's not going to be a liability. Yeah. Anyway, whatever. Even if it's not, I'm still playing On Sarah's Wings. And then you mentioned it, but divination is actually back in the core set. Are you stoked? That's got to be that's like one of your favorite cards.
I do like the card quite a bit, and I think that it does make your deck more consistent in a way that I like. So, I mean, all jokes aside, divination tends to be playable.
Mm-hmm. It does. It tends to be pretty good, actually. Do you have a feel for what types of deck you like to run it in, generally speaking?
The funny thing is, not actually decks that look like these, like the rest of these cards.
Like this blue-white flying thing.
Control deck, especially one with cheap interaction, and not as much in a deck that's trying to like curve out with flyers.
Okay. Still, welcome to the divination.
Oh yeah, and I'm excited about having it in this set because, again, looking back at the set, there's a lot of different themes going on. Something like divination could tie them together nicely.
Do you remember the last time we had divination in a core set? It was in 2014. Actually, I think they put it in 2015 also. But do you remember it in 2014?
In M 2014, it was busted.
Yeah, remember that? It was like the best common in the set.
And just okay there.
Yeah, it was in M15 as well, but I think you're right. It was just fine. But in M14, it was like the best common in the set.
It was very good. This is the set where Elixir of Immortality was a legit kill condition.
It was, yeah, and it had opportunity in the set as well. I did enjoy that set, though. It was a little towards one direction of the spectrum. I'm curious to see, though, of course, how Dominaria goes. That's going to do it, though, for this episode of the show. Hopefully, you are more prepared now than you were before for the set review next week, because we're going to be hitting that the Commons and Uncommons one coming up before you know it. So the set looks look. After coming off of a more narrow tribal stuff that I tend to not like as much, this has a core set with a twist feel to it that I'm pretty excited about. I really enjoyed the core sets when they were out as kind of a palette cleanser of a, multicolored tribal, blah, blah, blah block. It was just test your sort of baseline limited knowledge. And as long as they put enough build arounds or interesting 1-2 punches in, the set can actually have a pretty long shelf life for us drafters as well. The truth is that sometimes if they don't have enough of those, that it can fall a little flat. You're like, yeah, I know what a 3/2 flyer does. I'm going to put it in my deck, and that's kind of it. So that's kind of the tension that they're trying to walk, because clearly they're going for a lot of that top down design that we like from the core sets and from the original sets from Alpha and way back in the day. So hopefully that stuff will continue to work its way over here to Dominaria. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. If you want to find anything on Channel Fireball, channelfireball.com front page is where you're going to find all the articles and stuff. And then on the stores where you can find everything that you want to buy or sell. That's right. You can sell your cards back to them. Did you know that? 30% bonus for trading them in as well. That can be used for, I don't know, a box of Dominaria or some packs or whatever you need, so that you can draft with your friends. Or if you're filling out a constructed deck, you can get the few last singles that you need to get that deck together and start beating down. And you can transform those crappy rares that you opened up you're never going to use, that are sitting on your desk, into something good. At 30% bonus on trade-ins. Great. And hey, if you just need cash, you can trade them in for cash as well. Channelfireball.com for that. That's going to do it for our rules and mechanics show for Dominaria. When we come back next week, we'll have the set review. We'll see you then.
So taking a look at some of these old Dominaria cards reminded me of drafting Onslaught, which is the set which had Goblin War Chief and Scorp Prospector and all those things. And it reminded me so there was a great creature type update a bunch of years ago, right? So all these creatures got new creature types. And looking at like Avon Sentry, which is, bird soldier or whatever, it reminded me of how much that actually messed up Onslaught draft. And which didn't matter because it wasn't a format being drafted at the time. But one of the themes of Onslaught was tribal, right? And one of the big themes in Legions, which the second set, was Amplify. So you had a card like Daru Stinger. It's 3 and a white, 1/1. And it has Amplify, which is for every soldier you reveal. As you play this, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and then you can tap it to deal that much damage to an attacker or blocker.
Okay.
Well, with the creature type update, everything became human. It used to just be soldier. All of a sudden...
Oh, really?
Human clerics and human wizards and human soldiers, but the way Amplify works is as long as it shares a creature type. So I remember playing Daru Stinger with 2 soldiers in my hand and thinking, okay, I'm going to make a 3/3. But then my whole hand lights up because all my clerics also are humans now. And
oh my God.
All of a sudden it just comes 6 and I'm like, wow, okay, well this draft format's kind of stupid now. It just completely demolished that draft format.
That is great. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the cards now, and the like creature bird, creature beast, creature org, somehow is a type of creature cat. Let's see what it's now an elemental cat. This random, or actually that's not a random card, that's Blistering Fire Cat. But still, I just clicked on it for fun, and these are all, almost all of these have extra things now.
Another fallback of it is, did you know that Arcbound Ravager is a beast?
I do know that for some reason. Was it always a beast?
No, it was just an artifact creature because they used to not even have types. But
oh my god, that's crazy.
But
why is it a beast?
It's now a beast because I guess it's a beast. I don't know, which means you could use Contested Cliffs with Arcbound Ravager if you really wanted to.
What is that?
That's a land. It's again from Onslaught block. It's a taps for colorless, and you can pay red, green, and tap it, and have one of your beasts fight an opposing creature.
That's crazy.
So you can also
the sick modern tech, or what?
Well, it's not even legal in modern, actually.
Oh no,
it's from the set before modern, but yeah. So I don't know. Just looking at these Dominaria cards reminded me of Onslaught block, and it's like, yeah, that creature type update really did change things. So
it did, and this is, and by the way, these rule updates are going to change a few things going back as well.
The rules update will, functionally change how some cards work. So not a thing that's going to matter too much for limited, like you mentioned before, but something to keep in mind. And rules changes can have effects on old sets. And now that we're in the world of flashback sets or flashback drafts happening, sometimes you see the weird things that come up. And we'll see what the next chapter in this is. But I'm sure something else is going to happen along those lines.